Welcome to the Curious Case, where every mystery feels like a whispered secret over a late-night cup of tea. Today we delve into a story thick with tension and shadows, a tale that begins quietly, like a forgotten tune, before unraveling into something far more sinister. Meet Miss Evelyn Hart, a former schoolteacher, with a mind as sharp as frost, and eyes that miss nothing. Settle in, get comfortable, and allow the mystery to pull you in. And before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from? It's always a pleasure, knowing where our curious little community is gathering tonight. Now then, let's begin. The village of Audiobook was not known for excitement, a peaceful place wrapped in hedgerows and routine, where life moved slowly and secrets slept undisturbed. But that particular morning, an uneasy stillness clung to the air, the kind that made even birdsong sound cautious. The occasion was the long-anticipated reading of the late Eleanor Dovewood's will, a wealthy recluse whose death had sparked murmurs behind every lace-curtained window. The Dovewood estate, a grand and aging house atop Willow Rise, had always carried whispers of tragedy, lost love, and family disputes that stretched too far and too deep. The drawing room was crowded by 10 sharp, the fire lit despite the spring sun. Miss Hart sat unnoticed in the corner, pretending to be absorbed in her knitting, though her ears missed nothing. The family had gathered, strained smiles, stiff greetings, and the kind of tension that made every word feel heavier. There was the widowed niece Clara, pale and twitchy, her brother Simon, all bluster and impatience, and of course the enigmatic Lucille Dovewood, who'd arrived last, dressed in grey, with a smirk that unsettled more than charmed. The solicitor, Mr. Pembridge, cleared his throat and began to read, his voice even, the room too silent. The will was typical: donations, bequests, polite obligations, until one line shifted the air like a drop in temperature. To the person who truly understands what happened in the greenhouse that night, I leave everything. Gasps were swallowed, glances fired across the room. The greenhouse had been locked for years, abandoned since Eleanor's husband died under strange circumstances. Miss Hart didn't flinch. Instead, she glanced at the clock, noting Lucille's faint, knowing smile and Clara's sudden pallor. She'd seen this kind of panic before. Not guilt. No, something worse. Fear of being found out. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the ivy-covered windows, and far off, a single bell chimed noon. But in that room, time had stilled. Miss Hart knew, without doubt, that someone in this house had killed once, and someone else had finally decided it was time to speak. The mystery had begun, not with a scream, but with a sentence wrapped in velvet, and she, as always, would follow the thread no one else saw, where every tale unfolds like a secret whispered in candlelight, and where answers lie not in the obvious, but in the overlooked. Today I bring you a brand new mystery, one so tangled in time and silence, that its unraveling may stir more than just suspicion. So grab your cup of something warm, lean in, and allow me to introduce Miss Eleanor Wren, a retired schoolmistress, whose gentle nature concealed a razor-sharp intuition honed over years of observing the quiet cruelty of human behavior. Our story begins in the mist-veiled village of Elmridge, nestled in the folds of forgotten hills, where autumn had arrived with a vengeance, turning leaves to flame and air to chill. The occasion was the long-awaited memorial of Margaret Alcott, a woman whose sudden drowning 6 months prior had been deemed a tragic accident, mourned, then quietly shelved. But now, on the morning of the unveiling of her commemorative garden, the village buzzed with a peculiar mix of reverence and unease. As the townsfolk gathered near the ivy-draped statue, Eleanor stood silently at the edge of the crowd, her cane planted firmly in the damp earth, her eyes never leaving the widower, Charles Alcott, whose pale fingers gripped the edge of the stone bench like a man bracing against more than grief. His sister-in-law, the radiant and recently emboldened Olivia, fluttered around him like a flame too close to kindling, her hand brushing his shoulder a second too long, her smile just a hair too practiced. The vicar began his solemn speech, but Eleanor's attention shifted to the far end of the garden, to a boy no more than 12, standing utterly still beside the old greenhouse that had been locked for years. Something about his posture, frozen, wide-eyed, unblinking, drew her away from the speaker's words, and into the thrum of something unspoken. Minutes later, the boy bolted, pale as frost, muttering something incoherent, before disappearing behind the chapel wall. Whispers rippled. Eleanor, leaning on her cane, followed. Behind the greenhouse, overgrown with ivy and thyme, she found it a section of earth disturbed, the faint impression of something heavy having been moved, or buried. And there, just beside it, a brooch glinting in the weak sun. Margaret's brooch, the one Charles claimed had been lost during the drowning. Eleanor's breath slowed. Not fear. Calculation. She returned in time to hear Olivia's voice quiver, just enough to make the gathered clutch their coats tighter. But Eleanor knew better. She had seen Olivia 5 years ago, calm, smiling, delivering a eulogy for her own late husband, who'd fallen from the terrace of their summer home. And she remembered thinking then she mourned like a woman relieved. Back in the garden, as the vicar invited Charles to speak, he hesitated, his eyes darting briefly toward Olivia, then to Eleanor, who met his gaze with unsettling calm. It was the first time he looked truly afraid. The truth, Eleanor thought, was no longer buried. It had roots, and like all things planted in lies, it was beginning to bloom in the most unexpected places. The mystery had not only arrived, it had been waiting quietly, beneath their feet the entire time. There is a silence in old villages that doesn't merely fall. It grows slowly, deliberately, until it becomes a character in its own right, watching from the hedgerows, and listening at windowsills. And in the village of Darnley Hollow, that silence had begun to feel particularly heavy since the morning Eleanor Vale vanished on the eve of her engagement. The wedding was to be modest but meaningful, a joining of two families long interwoven through generations of land, loss, and quiet resentments. And though Eleanor was not considered a remarkable girl by most, a bit reserved, head always in a book, prone to walking the moors alone at dusk, she was known to be steady, kind, and utterly incapable of creating scandal, which is precisely why, when she failed to appear for the final dress fitting, not even her closest friends believed she'd run. At first they tried to comfort themselves with familiar tropes. A moment of panic, a woman overwhelmed, but the gown had already been laid out, the veil ironed, the shoes positioned just so beside the mirror. And then there was the blood. Not much, just a single dried smear along the inside of the window frame in the guest room where she'd slept the night before. Easily missed, easily dismissed, but not by Thomas Greaves. Greaves was no detective, just the aging caretaker of the Hollow Cemetery, a man with little to say, and much to notice. And something about the smear, the way it had been half-wiped, as if in haste, sat wrong with him. He said nothing at first. Not when they searched the woods with flashlights and fevered hope. Not when Eleanor's mother collapsed in the chapel pew. Not even when a pale-faced gardener recalled hearing a faint thud at midnight, followed by silence too deep for wind. Greaves simply watched, remembered, and later, much later, walked the path Eleanor was last known to take, past the crumbling wall near the old stone well. It was there he saw it, a silver locket, its chain snapped, its back engraved with the letter E in curling script. But there, in the damp earth nearby, was the imprint of a second pair of boots, larger than Eleanor's, and too deep to belong to someone merely walking. The boots had stopped just behind hers, and never left. That night, as thunder rolled over the moors and the townsfolk lit candles in windows not for warmth but for comfort, Greaves went to the constable. But by then, the story had already begun to twist. A cousin whispered of Eleanor's growing distance. A maid claimed to have seen her tear up a letter weeks earlier, and a neighbor swore she'd heard raised voices from the study the night before. Voices not belonging to Eleanor, or her fiancé, but to his brother, the one who returned from sea 3 months ago, with a smile too polished and eyes that never quite settled on yours. The official report would speak of heartbreak, of mental fragility, perhaps even of self-inflicted escape. But Greaves knew better. He'd buried enough villagers to recognize grief. And this was fear. The kind that seeps through the floorboards and clings to a room long after the door has been locked. So while the village resumed its rhythm, though slower, and with glances more cautious than before, Thomas Greaves kept the locket, cleaned the bloodstain, and began to visit the well every morning at dawn, waiting not for the return of the girl, but for the crack in someone's voice, the slip of a hand, or the moment silence finally spoke the truth. It had been hoarding all along. The Whitlock estate had always had a strange stillness about it. But on the evening that Adelaide Shaw disappeared, that stillness felt sharpened, like breath held too long behind closed doors. The drawing-room was dimly lit, despite the summer dusk, curtains drawn against the fading light, as though the family feared what might be seen, or worse, what might see in. Eleanor Whitlock, the matriarch, stood rigidly near the mantel, her pearl necklace clutched in one hand like a rosary, her expression carefully composed in that way only truly practiced liars manage. Beside her, her youngest son Nathaniel sat slouched in an armchair with an empty glass in hand, and eyes that didn't quite focus, as though they were pointed inward, somewhere deep and hidden. At the piano bench, her cousin Isobel, the plain one no one quite remembered inviting, played a soft meandering tune, something minor and unresolved, the kind of melody that suggested endings, not beginnings. Adelaide had been due to marry the eldest Whitlock heir, Jasper, that very morning, but now the ceremony had been called off under the pretense of illness, though no one had seen the bride since the night before. Miss Thorne, who had once been the schoolmistress, and now found herself the reluctant bearer of bad news, and worse suspicions, was summoned to the house under the guise of concern, but she knew better than to take such things at face value. The house didn't feel like it was mourning, it felt like it was hiding. Conversation was polite, too polite, the kind that skips over real things and floats nervously on the surface of nothing in particular. But Miss Thorne, with her unassuming coat and plain brown shoes, listened intently to the gaps between words, the awkward pauses, the glances exchanged when someone spoke Adelaide's name. There had been a fight, she was told quietly by a maid in the corridor, the sort of quarrel that hisses behind locked doors, and ends with someone storming out, or being pushed. The maid, young and clearly afraid, wouldn't say who had raised their voice, only that it had ended with a broken glass and blood on the tiles near the conservatory. Not much, just a smear, cleaned before dawn, but still, blood. Adelaide, the maid added, had been pale lately, distracted. She'd mentioned a letter she'd received from someone who shouldn't have known where to find her. No one had asked where she was from, not really. The Whitlocks had taken her in like one might take in a stray bird, more for show than for care. Her disappearance, whether flight or force, was an inconvenience more than a heartbreak, and yet the silence in the house was too tight, too brittle, as if the wrong word might cause everything to shatter. Miss Thorne saw it in Nathaniel's hand, the faint red mark on his wrist, like a grip that had been fought. She saw it in Eleanor's slipper, a faint smudge of soil on the hem, though the garden was drenched in morning rain, and none had gone walking. She saw it in the dog, old Rufus, whining outside the cellar door, pawing at it like something still moved beneath. The police would be called eventually, yes, but by then the narrative would be rehearsed, refined, polished to a shine. Adelaide had nerves, they'd say. She got spooked, vanished into the hills, maybe even took the train. These things happen. But Miss Thorne knew better. She knew the difference between absence and erasure, and she knew, as surely as she knew how to read a child's lie in their trembling voice, that the Whitlocks were not mourning a lost bride. They were burying a secret, one that had bled through the cracks, and would not stay quiet for long. It had been nearly dusk when the discovery was made, not by intention, but by accident, as most dark things are. The caretaker, Edmund Pritchard, an elderly man with a limp and a fondness for solitude, had gone to repair the rusted gate near the overgrown orchard at the western edge of the Whitlow estate. The area had been avoided for years, said to be the remnants of an old chapel that had burned down long before the current generation walked its halls. Yet as Edmund brushed away the thick ivy, his fingers caught on something cold and unyielding, not stone, but iron, fashioned into what appeared to be the lid of a sealed hatch. When he finally pried it open with an effort that left him wheezing, the smell hit him first, sharp, metallic, wrong. Beneath the hatch lay a chamber no one knew existed, and in it, wrapped in mold-stained linen, was a body, fresh, female, and unmistakably dressed in the same ivory gown that the missing bride, Celeste Alden, had last been seen wearing. News spread through the estate like wildfire, but it was not grief that followed. It was dread. Celeste had vanished only hours before her wedding to Julian Whitlow, the youngest heir to a family both revered and whispered about in town, and until now, her absence had been blamed on cold feet, or a secret lover. But this changed everything. Miss Alara Quinn, a reclusive investigator with a quiet grace and the eyes of a hawk, had already been present at the behest of a concerned aunt. But now, her presence took on new weight. She watched the family's reactions not for their words, but for the silences between them. Julian, pale and expressionless, merely nodded as though he'd expected this. His mother Beatrice, ever the hostess, excused herself to prepare tea in the middle of the revelation. The eldest brother Lionel poured a brandy with a shaking hand and didn't drink it. But it was the grandmother, old Sybil Whitlow, who muttered something that sent a chill down Alara's spine. She found the room. I told them to seal it years ago. The room, Alara pressed gently, and what followed was a fractured tale of a sealed-off chapel vault used for ancestral rituals, long dismissed as family folklore, until now. And yet the mystery deepened when the doctor, having examined the body, declared that Celeste had not been dead long, hours, not days, which meant someone had kept her alive somewhere in that house long after she vanished. It wasn't just a murder, it was imprisonment, it was cruelty, and it was recent. Alara's mind raced. The gown was torn, but not from struggle, from removal and redressing, likely done post-mortem, perhaps to send a message. But to whom? And why? The cellar had no direct access from outside. Someone from within had opened that chamber. Someone still living under this roof had chosen that place, that moment, that cruel end. Yet it was what Alara found later, when reviewing the old floor plans of the estate, that turned suspicion into certainty. A single hallway no longer present in the renovated layout, leading directly from the east wing, where Julian's locked study remained curiously off-limits. Whatever secrets this family had buried, they were not from generations past. They were fresh, bloody, and walking quietly among the living. The drawing room of the Holloway Manor had always been a place of quiet elegance, with its ivory-paneled walls and faded portraits, watching from above like silent jurors. But on this particular morning, it felt like a courtroom, charged, brittle, holding its breath. The news of the body found in the chapel cellar had not yet fully sunk in when attention turned toward the family, and Miss Alara Quinn took her place at the edge of the room, like a shadow that listened. Lady Agatha Holloway, the groom's mother, sat poised as always in her rose-tinted armchair, but the stillness of her hands betrayed her, the knuckles white as bone, where they gripped the armrest, the corners of her mouth trembling just slightly with every whispered mention of the girl they had all believed was Juliet. Across from her, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Halcombe, held her teacup so delicately, it might as well have been glass. Her eyes darted every time someone mentioned the chapel's sealed vault. But it was Isadora, the late Lord Holloway's estranged sister, who drew Alara's focus. She hadn't spoken much since her return to the estate for the wedding, but today, she looked almost content, her pale blue eyes sharp and satisfied, in a way that felt utterly out of place. Something had unraveled, and she had known it would. Elora took it all in, the glances, the stiff silences, the words left unsaid. What unsettled her most was the discovery made just that morning. The dead woman wasn't Juliet Langford at all. The coroner's preliminary examination revealed subtle surgical scars, altered features, and a dental mismatch. The true bride, it seemed, had disappeared days before the ceremony, and someone else had stepped into her place, willingly or not. No one yet knew. The impersonator had lived among them, walked the halls, said the vows, until someone ended her life with chilling precision. But why? Elora thought of the Holloway family's legacy, an empire built on inheritance and silence, and the whispers of an inheritance clause that would have denied Julian everything, if his bride were not of a pure lineage. A clause only Isadora, the forgotten aunt, had ever seemed to care about preserving. There were too many lies, too many people with something to lose if the truth surfaced. A staged marriage to protect a fortune. A woman silenced before she could speak. As the constable paced the room, fumbling with his notepad, Elora remained still, her eyes fixed on the fireplace. She saw it now, not just a murder, but a performance. Someone had orchestrated this with care, knowing that confusion would follow, that grief would buy them time. But time, she thought, was running thin. There was blood beneath the chapel floor, and secrets folded inside silk dresses, and handwritten letters. The question wasn't who wore Juliet's face, it was who demanded she wear it, and why her death came the moment the veil was lifted. As Reverend Alcott rummaged through the drawer of his ancient writing desk, its brass handle squeaking with the weight of forgotten years, his muttering broke the uneasy silence of the vicarage. Words half-formed as if he were speaking more to ghosts than to Miss Elora Quinn, who sat watching with that eerie calm she was known for. "Ah, here it is," he finally murmured, lifting a worn photo album, its leather cover cracked like dried earth, its corners softened by time, and too many hands. As he laid it open, the pages crackled softly, exhaling the scent of dust and age, and Elora leaned in, not out of politeness, but because something unspoken stirred in her bones. The Reverend's hand paused on one particular image, a faded photograph, that immediately caught Elora's sharp eye. Two young women standing at a seaside promenade, arm in arm, their smiles too perfectly mirrored. "Both Lavinias," he whispered, pointing with a trembling finger. They were known as the two Lenas back then, inseparable, like mirror twins. The resemblance was uncanny, unsettling even, and Elora's mind began to pull at the threads. The woman found murdered near the old chapel. This was no random imposter. She was one of them. They were close once, the Reverend continued, his voice dropping as if wary of being overheard. But there was a falling out, quiet, bitter, not the kind you forget, but the kind no one dares bring up. Elora's eyes stayed fixed on the photo, the grainy smile of the second Lavinia, sharper jawline, a colder gaze, speaking volumes. "What caused it?" she asked, softly but firmly. The Reverend hesitated, fingers tapping the album's edge like a nervous metronome. "A man," he said finally, eyes drifting to the window. "Lavinia's first betrothed, Thomas Raycroft." There were whispers of betrayal, of stolen affection. One of them was promised to him, but the other claimed him. Then he died, suddenly. Some said accident, others didn't. Elora leaned back slowly, her thoughts turning over like cogs in a locked clock. It wasn't rivalry. It was war masked in lace. These weren't girls fighting over dresses and dances. This was something deeper, a buried hatred with roots that ran all the way to the altar. And now, decades later, one Lavinia was missing, and the other had died in her gown. Or had she? The question clawed at Elora. Had the wrong Lavinia worn the veil? Had the wedding been hijacked, not for love, but for legacy, for vengeance long overdue? If the dead woman had taken her identity, was it to protect her, or destroy her? And what if she wasn't the imposter at all? What if the Lavinia they all thought they knew, the one who vanished, had been the deceiver all along? Elora felt the weight of it pressing in, that bitter truth hiding just beneath the surface. This was no ordinary case of mistaken identity. This was a reckoning, wrapped in lace and sealed with blood. As the Reverend mumbled on about the old summer house they used to frequent, the place where the girls had last been seen together alone, Elara's eyes narrowed. There, she thought, that's where it turned. That's where love turned to loathing, and where this tragedy truly began. Misunderstandings had only scratched the surface. Elara Quinn could feel the full weight of the mystery settling into place like a storm about to break. Someone had carefully, methodically crafted the illusion that Lavinia had fled, leaving chaos in her wake, but Elara knew better. This wasn't a simple runaway bride story. It reeked of deeper rot. What if the wedding had been a smokescreen? A final act in a much older play, a performance meant to silence something buried long before the invitations were ever sent. As the sun dipped low, casting fractured shadows across the cobbled lanes of Winthorpe, Elara walked with purpose, her thoughts tangled in everything she'd uncovered. The family's pristine reputation, the cold smiles, the unsaid words, they were all protective veils over a wound no one dared to expose. She sensed it. Something terrible had happened once long ago, and someone had killed to keep it sealed. The village, tucked far from the main roads and hidden behind overgrown hedges and aging stone walls, held a stillness that unnerved even her. The inn, with its smoke-stained windows and creaky timbers, was nearly silent save for the ticking of a crooked wall clock. The innkeeper, a stocky man with a nose like a smashed plum, and the eyes of someone who had seen too much, and regretted every second, had offered little but suspicion when she asked about the woman from London. Still her instincts flared. He was hiding something, or rather, someone. And when Elara stepped into the dimly lit parlor, she saw her, Lavinia, or what remained of her. No longer the poised young woman from society columns and bridal announcements. This Lavinia was pale, gaunt, and sunk into the corner of the room like a ghost trying to disappear into the wallpaper. Her shoulders were hunched, eyes darting to every creak and whisper, as if danger lurked behind each teacup. Elara approached gently, watching as the girl flinched before quickly composing herself, the veneer of poise cracking beneath the weight of weeks, maybe months of fear. Her voice, when it came, was a breath, not a sentence. "I never wanted any of this," she whispered, her hands clutching the edges of her shawl like a lifeline. The innkeeper had the sense to leave them alone, but even then the room felt crowded, with memories, with regret, with fear. Lavinia poured the tea with shaking hands, the clink of the porcelain louder than it should have been. Her movements were rehearsed, mechanical, like a doll programmed to simulate normalcy. Elara didn't press. She had learned that truth, when forced, often retreated. She let the silence stretch, let it weigh heavy between them, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, Lavinia began to unravel, not in a dramatic confession, but in fragmented phrases and haunted glances. The truth was buried. Yes, but not in a grave. It was buried in guilt, in loyalty to a family that had demanded too much, in a history of betrayal that stretched generations deep. Elara didn't know yet who had killed to protect the lie, but as she looked into Lavinia's terrified eyes, she knew one thing for certain. This girl had run not because she was guilty, but because she was the only one left alive who knew the truth. It was often in the quietest of moments, when time seemed to hold its breath, that truth dared to surface, and in the dim glow of the inn's parlor, Lavinia finally let her mask slip. Her eyes, wide and restless, darted toward the door as though even the creak of wood might summon danger. Then, with a voice so faint it barely stirred the air, she whispered, "Someone warned me. They said if I went through with the wedding, I wouldn't leave the church alive." The words settled like frost, sharp and undeniable, sending a chill through Elara Quinn that no fire could chase away. This wasn't doubt, wasn't hesitation born from a broken heart. This was raw, visceral fear. And the kind of fear that made a woman vanish on the cusp of marriage was never baseless. Lavinia's pale face twitched at the memory of the threat, her fingers tightening involuntarily around her shawl, her voice trembling. I didn't know who to trust. I didn't know if it was a cruel lie or something real. But I couldn't risk it. Not for a man I hardly knew. Not when I'd already lost so much. Elara nodded, her silence giving Lavinia space to breathe, to remember. This wasn't some runaway bride scandal fabricated for headlines. This was something darker, buried beneath layers of secrecy, family pride and old wounds. Elara gently placed her teacup on the table, the delicate clink loud in the stillness, then fixed her gaze on Lavinia, calm but piercing. What did you mean by everything you've already lost? She asked softly. Lavinia hesitated, the weight of memory pressing down until her shoulders sagged and her voice dropped again, cracked and heavy. There was someone before, years ago, a man my parents despised. They did everything they could to erase him from my life, and they succeeded, or so they thought, but it didn't stop me from loving him. Her eyes shimmered, not with tears, but with the grief of what never had the chance to be. Elara didn't interrupt. She'd learned long ago that people only revealed their truths when they were ready, and Lavinia, for all her fragility, was on the edge of catharsis. He was part of our past, she continued, her fingers now twisting the fringe of her shawl with restless energy. Tied to the land, tied to the name. My father, he said letting him stay would ruin everything. So they exiled him, silenced his name. But they couldn't erase the feeling. Her voice trailed off, brittle and low. I thought I could forget. I tried. I thought marrying someone new might be a new beginning. But some things, they don't leave you. Some ghosts don't fade. They wait. Elara watched her, the pieces turning slowly in her mind. This was no ordinary love lost. This was a fracture that had split through generations. A forbidden attachment that had bled into the present. And now, someone was willing to kill to keep it buried. The past was no longer past. It was breathing, watching, hunting. Elara Quinn leaned in slightly, her eyes steady, her hands folded with deliberate calm, though inside her thoughts raced with quiet urgency. And after the engagement, she asked gently, what changed? Lavinia's gaze darkened as the shadows of memory flickered behind her eyes. Her entire posture stiffened, like someone bracing for a storm. That's when the letters began, she said softly, her voice rough around the edges. At first they were just notes. Anonymous. Someone said they knew about my past. About him. Her eyes dropped to her lap, fingers knotting around each other. But they didn't stop there. The messages became threats. They said if I went through with the marriage, they'd expose everything. The affair. My family's history. The lies. Everything we'd buried. Elara's expression didn't change. But the flicker in her eyes told Lavinia. She understood the weight of blackmail. How insidious it was. How it slithered into every corner of one's life. And poisoned everything it touched. Did you pay them? She asked, her voice low. Lavinia shook her head slowly, shame etched in the lines of her face. No, I couldn't. I thought if I ignored them they'd stop. But they didn't. They only got worse, more frequent, more vicious. And they knew things. Things no outsider could possibly know. Elara exhaled slowly. The pieces were forming a pattern now, dark and intricate. This wasn't just a woman fleeing an unhappy engagement. This was someone fleeing a tightening noose. Lavinia continued, her voice thin and ragged with suppressed fear. Every letter had one demand. Stay quiet, or everything burns. And it wasn't just about me anymore. They said things that hinted at deeper secrets. Old ones. Things that would destroy more than my name. Her breath caught. I couldn't marry him. Not once I realized the truth. The letters weren't coming from a stranger. They were from someone close. Someone in that house. Someone who would kill to protect what had been hidden. Elara sat back slightly, the implications curling around her like smoke. This wasn't just blackmail. It was a power play. A trap. A silencing. Lavinia had been poised to marry into a family steeped in its own rot. And someone, perhaps even the man she was meant to marry, was ready to bury her past, and her to preserve the illusion of respectability. "You did the right thing," Elara said at last, her voice quiet but firm, "even if it doesn't feel like it. The truth always surfaces, Lavinia. Eventually. But you chose survival. That matters." She didn't say what she was thinking, that the secrets weren't just Lavinia's burden anymore. Now that she was involved, they belonged to both of them. And Elara Quinn never left a puzzle unsolved, or a threat unanswered. The sorrow in Lavinia's voice lingered in the air like the echo of a confession too long withheld. But it was Miss Quinn's quiet stillness that carried the weight of the moment. And yet Elara said softly, "The real question remains. Who among them was willing to go that far? To silence the past? To guard secrets with blood?" She stood slowly, her movement as composed as it was deliberate, her eyes never leaving Lavinia's haunted face. "There are things we cannot undo," she continued. "But there's always a choice in what we do next. And often, the truth hides not in the grand gestures, but in the smallest of details, the ones that slip past every watchful eye." Lavinia's gaze lifted, tremulous, uncertain. But in the dim flicker of oil lamp light, a faint spark of hope returned to her face. "Do you think you can help me?" she asked, her voice the barest thread. Elara didn't offer easy promises. She only gave a soft, knowing smile. "I don't know yet. But I do know this. Truth never stays buried forever. Eventually, it claws its way to the surface, even through stone." As she turned to leave, Elara felt the shift within her. A quiet fire had been lit, and the case was far from over. Whatever darkness had taken root in the Kingsley estate was about to be exposed. And it would not go quietly. The estate itself seemed to carry the weight of its secrets in its bones. Ivy strangled the walls and the windows, though Grand stared outward like hollow eyes. She returned to the vicarage later that evening, the scent of damp stone and dust lingering in the old chapel air. Across from her sat Reverend Alden, his demeanor warm but weary, his eyes betraying a man who had seen far more than he ever dared to share. As he spoke in slow, deliberate tones, Elara listened, sifting through his words like a code. "There was a girl, Emma," he said finally. "A maid, 20 years ago. She worked for the Kingsleys. Quiet, shy, barely spoke. But she saw everything, Miss Quinn. Everything." He paused, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "One day she was just gone. They said it was an accident. She drowned in the brook near the orchard. Slipped, they claimed. But I remember her bruises. And I remember the silence afterward. No one mourned her. No one questioned it. It was as if the family had agreed, unspoken, to never speak her name again." Alara's breath slowed, the pieces starting to shift into place like an ancient puzzle, long buried under dust. This wasn't just a maid who had died. This was the origin of something deeper. A secret so dangerous it had echoed across decades. And if Emma had seen something she shouldn't have, then Lavinia's blackmail, her threats, the man in the shadows, were not the start of the mystery. They were the consequences of something much older, something rooted in betrayal, control and silence. The vicar leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Whatever happened back then, Miss Quinn, it never truly left that house. I believe it's still there, watching, waiting. And if you dig deep enough, you'll find what Emma saw. I only pray it doesn't find you first." Alara's eyes narrowed, not in fear, but in resolve. The thread she'd pulled was leading her straight into the belly of something old, something dangerous. And she intended to follow it all the way to the end, no matter who or what tried to stop her. The vicar's voice dropped to little more than a breath, a haunted murmur that trembled at the edge of confession, as if even the walls around them had ears, and the past itself might come slithering back to punish him for speaking its name. "Emma's death," he said, staring not at Elara, but at some fixed point in the air, "was never the end of it. She left behind a child, a girl." The words hung heavy between them, like dust stirred from a long-sealed crypt. Elara felt the stillness shift in the room, not with shock, but with the sudden realization of just how deeply the roots of this family's deceit had burrowed. "A child," she repeated, the syllables slow, reverent, as though saying it aloud might summon the soul of a girl erased from the world. The vicar nodded with great reluctance, his face pale, his hands trembling as they folded into each other. The girl was born in secret. Her mother was never married. And the father, he was someone no one dared to name. Not then. Not now. The Kingsleys made sure of that. They buried the scandal with such cold precision. You'd think it was a matter of estate business, not a human life. Emma died under suspicious circumstances. Yes, but the real tragedy was what came after. The baby, Marianne, was whisked away to a distant relative of a servant, raised in obscurity, her very existence scrubbed from every ledger and memory that might have tied her to this house. Alara's mind spun, the picture becoming clearer, darker. This woman who had emerged under the guise of Lavinia had not been a con artist or a deluded stranger. She had been a ghost returned to claim her name. Marianne hadn't stolen a life. She had been born to it. She hadn't come for money or attention, but for reckoning, to force the Kingsleys to look into the eyes of the daughter they had orphaned by choice. And now she was dead, her body discarded like an afterthought in the old well, the same way her mother had been discarded 2 decades earlier. Alara's chest tightened. She could almost see Marianne arriving at the estate, heart pounding, eyes scanning the walls that should have been hers to grow up within. She must have imagined it, her mother's scent in the air, a child's memory of whispered lullabies, beneath a cracked ceiling. She must have believed the truth could be confronted, that justice was possible, but someone still living, had made sure that truth stayed buried. Alara's eyes locked onto the vicar's. She wasn't an imposter, she said, her voice low and sure. She was the heir they silenced once, and silenced again. The vicar gave no answer, but the flicker in his eyes told her all she needed to know. The Kingsley family hadn't just hidden a secret, they had destroyed the proof of it, and now Alara knew. This wasn't about love, or even betrayal. It was about legacy, and the lengths people would go to keep a stolen one intact. Miss Alara Marple murmured softly, almost as if speaking to the room itself rather than the man beside her. This wasn't coincidence. It was a reckoning. The return of Marianne, hidden daughter of a silenced servant, was not a cry for help. It was a deliberate act of confrontation, an attempt to exhume the past, and force the Kingsley family to look upon the bones they'd buried in shallow earth. And then, as if a long frozen reel of truth had begun to turn, another piece of the picture clicked into place with chilling clarity. The elusive man seen accompanying Lavinia in the weeks before the wedding, the one her family whispered about with barely veiled contempt, wasn't some scandalous lover. He was a private investigator, hired by Lavinia herself. The vicar, pale and visibly shaken, exhaled a confession through tight lips. "We were wrong," he said, his eyes heavy with guilt. She wasn't running from love. She was running from danger. She wanted to know what she was marrying into. Alara leaned forward, her fingers drumming against the velvet armrest, her mind slicing through the fog like a scalpel. "Then Lavinia knew," she said. She knew about Emma's child, about the bloodline buried beneath centuries of reputation. The vicar nodded once, slow and burdened, confirming the worst. Lavinia had uncovered the family's darkest inheritance, the discarded daughter, the scandal wiped clean from the archives, and the lies stitched carefully into the family's fabric for decades. And when she realized her marriage to Alexander Kingsley would bind her to a legacy soaked in betrayal and death, she vanished. But not out of fear, out of refusal. Marianne's death wasn't misfortune, it was prevention. Alara could see it now with harrowing clarity. The girl had come not to destroy the Kingsleys, but to claim her rightful place. Her presence threatened to upend everything: titles, inheritance, and the carefully curated myth of respectability. So they did what the Kingsleys had always done when the truth became inconvenient. They silenced it, permanently. It wasn't just murder, Alara whispered, her voice carrying the weight of her realization. It was a cover-up, executed with the same cold precision they used to erase her mother. The vicar said nothing, but his silence was louder than any confession. His fingers trembled. His lips pressed into a line of quiet despair. The guilt threaded through his posture spoke volumes. Alara stood slowly, the air around her thick with unspoken truths. The Kingsleys weren't merely guilty of a hidden affair. They were custodians of a lie so deep it had swallowed generations whole. Now, with Marianne dead and Lavinia vanished into shadows, Alara knew the house was beginning to tremble. Not from wind or age, but from the weight of its own secrets preparing to erupt. Alara Marple remained still, her silhouette framed by the fading afternoon light that poured in through the tall windows of the vicar's study, casting long shadows across the worn floorboards like spectral echoes of the past. Her mind pulsed with revelations, every thread of deceit, every half-truth, every carefully hidden transgression, weaving together into a suffocating tapestry that had strangled the Kingsley family for decades. The air in the room was thick, not just with silence, but with the weight of everything left unsaid. The Reverend sat across from her, his shoulders hunched beneath invisible burdens, his eyes dark with guilt and disbelief. "Do you see it now, Reverend?" she asked, her voice no louder than a breath, but cutting through the stillness like a blade. "This family, so consumed by its desire to preserve a name etched in cold stone, has cultivated a garden of rot. In shielding themselves from disgrace, they've allowed their sins to fester in the shadows, and now the past, so long denied, demands its due." She watched as his hands trembled over the teacup, porcelain clinking lightly against saucer, betraying his attempt at composure. "But what can we do now?" he asked, his voice strained, brittle with the sorrow of a man who had spent too long looking the other way. "We can't rewrite what's already been lived." Alara's gaze softened, but her resolve remained unshaken. She took a slow sip of tea, the warmth grounding her before she answered. "It's never about rewriting, Reverend. It's about unveiling, about refusing to let silence have the last word. Sometimes it's not justice we need, it's illumination. Truth has a way of stripping everything bare, and only in that exposure can healing begin." Her words lingered like incense, their weight filling every corner of the room. She rose slowly, the movement unhurried, dignified, as if even the air respected her certainty. "The Kingsleys cannot escape what they've hidden," she continued, turning to the window, where the grey sky churned with the promise of rain. "Their walls may be thick, their wealth immense, but secrets rot from within. And now, with blood on their hands and a false bride buried beneath their lies, they will face what they have long evaded." As the clock ticked solemnly behind her, the final hour of deception approached. In that quiet vicarage, once a place of peace, the truth now stirred like a storm on the horizon. The Reverend remained seated, silent, the truth settling upon him like a heavy cloak. Alara turned back to him, her eyes piercing, her voice steady. "This wasn't about a runaway bride, Reverend. It was about the cost of silence, the consequence of erasure. And now, every lie is rising to the surface, bloated, undeniable, and soaked in guilt." She paused, and the room seemed to hold its breath. "I've reconstructed it all. The affair, the deception, the cover-up, the murder. It was never just a disappearance. It was a reckoning, and it has only just begun." Her tone cool and deliberate, sliced through the stagnant air of the vicarage, like a blade through silk. "Every step of this dark affair, every calculated action taken under the weight of ancestral shame, had not been driven by love or joy, but by a gnawing, relentless desperation, to preserve the illusion of nobility." Miss Marple's voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had seen too many lies dressed as virtues, her observations sharp, unflinching, and devastatingly precise. "The true mistake," she said, her gaze drifting toward the trembling tea in the vicar's cup, "was not Lavinia's." She paused, letting the truth hang like a guillotine. It was her would-be mother-in-law, Mrs. Barrington. She believed the woman in the well, the impostor bride, was Lavinia herself, and in that single fatal error, she doomed them all. The vicar recoiled slightly, color draining from his face, as he set his teacup down with a quiet clink, his voice barely audible. So she killed her. Miss Marple gave a slow, sorrowful nod. Yes. She saw what she wanted to see. A threat, a danger to the family name. And in a fit of panic and delusion, she took matters into her own hands. She acted not with malice, but with madness born of fear. She thought she was saving her son's future, but instead, she buried it beneath stone and silence. The Reverend stared into the fading light, horror creeping across his features, like a shadow at dusk. But how could she make such a mistake? He whispered. Miss Marple folded her hands calmly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the past she had unearthed. Desperation, Reverend, she replied, her voice cool and haunting. It blinds reason. It distorts truth. She didn't see a grieving daughter or a stranger seeking justice. She saw scandal, shame and ruin. She saw a dagger, aimed at her family's legacy, and lashed out before thinking. Her voice sharpened, slicing through the thickening silence. And Caroline, don't forget her, the groom's sister. She was no innocent bystander. She had been blackmailing Lavinia for months, holding a youthful indiscretion over her head like a guillotine. She knew about the affair, one the family had tried desperately to erase from memory, and she used it like a weapon. The vicar winced as if struck. Blackmail, Caroline, he echoed, his disbelief fragile. Miss Marple nodded with grim certainty. Yes, she saw opportunity, power, control. She wanted influence, and Lavinia's shame was the key. Fear and greed, they twist even the gentlest hearts. Reverend, Caroline wasn't protecting anyone. She was carving a seat for herself at a table she thought she deserved. As her words settled, heavy and damning, the room seemed to shrink around them. The vicar sat frozen in his chair, the weight of the truth pressing down like centuries of guilt, resting on a single breath. And still the storm outside had yet to break, the quiet before a reckoning that would change everything. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, the afternoon light catching the faint lines of time etched across her face, her eyes thoughtful yet unwavering, as the final pieces of the puzzle settled into place with a quiet, devastating clarity. Caroline, she began, saw an opportunity to gain power over Lavinia, and she seized it without hesitation. It was not malice in the traditional sense. It was calculation, pure and cold. She wanted control, leverage, to rise in the family's internal hierarchy by exploiting Lavinia's past like a loaded weapon. But secrets, Reverend, do not stay where we bury them. They rot, they spread, and in Caroline's case, her scheme only made everything more perilous, not just for Lavinia, but for the entire Kingsley legacy. She let that truth hang in the silence, as the vicar's expression twisted with regret. And as for the story of the runaway bride, she continued, her voice growing firmer, that was never reality. That was theater, an illusion crafted not by Lavinia herself, but by those around her who feared the consequences of truth. She was coerced, Reverend, coerced into vanishing, into silence, into playing the role of the disgraceful bride who fled on the eve of her wedding. It was a convenient lie, woven quickly in panic, to hide something much darker. The murder of Marianne, the forgotten daughter, the maid's child, had already happened, and to avoid suspicion, they needed Lavinia gone. Not dead, not questioned, just gone. The vicar's throat tightened as his eyes widened with the full realization. So she didn't run. No. Miss Marple answered quietly. She never intended to leave. She was silenced by fear, pressure and manipulation. And when I look back at the subtle signs, the moments no one else saw, the strained smiles, the hesitations, the way she clutched that brooch the night before, I realized she was crying out, but no one was listening. The vicar placed his head in his hands, his breath shallow, broken. I never saw it. I was here. How did I miss it? Miss Marple's voice was gentler now, almost forgiving. Because, Reverend, the closest eyes are often the blindest. Truth hides best in plain sight when emotion clouds the lens. She paused, her gaze drifting toward the stained glass window, where colors flickered quietly against the floor. In small villages like this, secrets are not only hidden, they're groomed, fed, shaped into something acceptable. But when those secrets are left to fester, they consume everything, and in this case, they devoured the innocent. Her words came like falling stones, measured and heavy. Marianne died trying to uncover her past. Lavinia nearly vanished beneath the weight of everyone else's shame. And all because a family decided its name was more valuable than its people. The vicar nodded slowly, his voice hoarse. It all seems so senseless now. It always does, Miss Merrill replied, her voice barely above a whisper, when the truth finally surfaces. But there is always a price. One life was taken, another nearly lost, and a family must now face the ghosts they tried so desperately to bury. She stood, smoothing the creases from her skirt, the air around her still and charged. There will be no more running, Reverend. The truth is here now, and whether they accept it or not, it will not be buried again. The name she was protecting, Miss Merrill murmured to herself, wasn't just the family's. It was her own fragile sense of place in a world built on illusion. The desperation that had bled through generations had created something more dangerous than just a legacy. It had become a trap, a beautifully furnished prison, where love, truth and integrity were sacrificed at the altar of appearances. No one in that house had emerged unscathed. Not Lavinia, who bore the guilt of secrets that weren't hers to keep. Not Marianne, whose death had become a footnote in the Kingsley history, until Miss Merrill gave it a voice. And certainly not Mrs. Barrington, whose act of violence had been committed in the name of protection, but had only carved deeper wounds. Miss Merrill took a final sip of her tea, her movement slow, almost ceremonial. Her gaze rested on the trembling hands of the vicar across from her. Behind every crime, Reverend, she said softly, there is always a little human foolishness, fear, pride, shame, a need so deep to hide the truth that people lose themselves in the attempt. Her words were not accusatory. They were simply true. The vicar, once a steady rock in his parish, looked aged by the revelations, staring into his cup, as if the answers to absolution might be floating there. What happens now, Miss Merrill? He asked at last, his voice paper-thin. What happens to them? She let the question hang in the air, like incense rising in silence. Her voice dropped to a whisper. The truth will come out, Reverend. It always does. Not always on our terms, not always gently, but inevitably. And when it does, it will hurt. For them. For this village. For you. But pain is not always a punishment. It is sometimes a path. She stood, her posture still sharp, her presence calm as glass before a storm. We can't change the past. We can only drag it into the light, and hope that in doing so, it stops consuming the present. The reckoning will come, not with pitchforks or police, but with the quiet realization that everything they built was hollow. And maybe, just maybe, that will be enough to begin healing. As she walked to the door, she paused with one final thought, her voice almost too soft to hear. Secrets are like roots beneath the floorboards. No matter how deep you bury them, they'll rise. They crack foundations. They find the light. Always. And with that, she stepped into the golden hush of the afternoon, leaving the vicar in silence, the teacups cooling beside untouched scones, and unraveling truths. The wedding, when it finally happened days later, bore no resemblance to the grand affair once envisioned. The gowns were still fine, the chapel still polished, but the soul of the event had shifted. The crowd had thinned, to only those too bound by blood or burden to stay away. There were no bright flowers, no celebratory cheers, no hurried children weaving through pews. The guests wore their Sunday best, but their expressions bore the weight of something far older than the occasion. A legacy. A lie. Lavinia stood at the altar like a statue carved from restraint, her dress elegant but simple, her eyes no longer wide with dreams, but heavy with knowledge. The groom was quiet, visibly altered, his glances toward his mother vacant with unspoken judgment. When the vows were exchanged, they were spoken not with joy, but with a quiet dignity. Two people shackled to duty, not desire. Even the church bells, when they finally rang, sounded distant, as though echoing down a tunnel of grief rather than celebration. It was not a union of love, but a sealing of consequences. A ceremony haunted not by what was said, but by everything that had been silenced. And in the quiet that followed, even the air seemed to know. Nothing in the Kingsley name would ever sound the same again. Lavinia stood at the altar, her expression a mixture of calm and something far deeper, an underlying weariness that was only briefly hidden beneath the veil of her formal composure. Her eyes flickered to the groom, but it was a fleeting glance, more out of obligation than affection. Her gaze soon turned away, locking onto the ceremony with a solemn focus, as if it were a distant duty she had to perform rather than a joyous moment. She was no longer the young woman with dreams of a future she had once imagined. Lavinia was a woman marked, not just by her troubled past, but by everything that had unfolded around her in the last few days. She had been forced into a role she never asked for, a part in a tragedy that threatened to consume her. And yet, here she was, taking this final step toward a life that had nearly been stolen from her, her very existence overshadowed by the sins of those she had called family. At the back of the church, Miss Marple sat, her presence almost invisible in the dimness, her posture upright but relaxed. Her sharp eyes scanned the room, absorbing every movement, every shift of emotion. She watched the ceremony unfold with the kind of understanding only someone like her could possess. She had seen this story before, the deadly dance of lies and deceit that led to this moment. A tragedy long hidden, a truth dragged into the light, and loves that could never be the same. But Miss Marple felt no triumph in this scene. There was no sense of victory or moral superiority, not even a small spark of satisfaction. Instead, her gaze was filled with a quiet sense of resolution, the contentment of someone who had quietly placed the final piece into a puzzle that had taken its toll on everyone involved. The vows exchanged were like the closing of a door, a necessary formality, perhaps, but no more than that. Miss Marple had done what she could. The truth was now known, the family's secrets no longer safely hidden away in the dark. But even as she observed Lavinia and her groom, there was no comfort in the outcome. She had unraveled their deceit, forced the truth into the open, but the damage had already been done. This was not a ceremony of healing, it was a ceremony of reckoning. The past could not be undone. It had left its scars, deep and indelible, on both the Kingsley family and Lavinia herself. From her seat in the back pew, Miss Marple's heart was heavy with sorrow, not for Lavinia, for she had found her truth, painful though it was, but for the family she had once tried to protect. The Kingsleys. They had lived their lives in the shadow of their lies, and now no matter how much they tried to paint over their past, the truth would always linger beneath the surface. This wedding, while meant to symbolize a new beginning, was also a reminder of everything that had been lost, a life, a reputation, and the family's collective soul, fractured beyond repair. As the ceremony drew to a close, Miss Marple's mind was quiet but full, like the calm after a storm. Justice, she thought, had been served in the most bittersweet of ways. The family's secrets were exposed, the truth had been revealed, and Lavinia had been allowed to step into the light of her own life. But the finality of it all was not a victory. It was a somber truth. For all the pain and bloodshed, the Kingsleys would never be the same, and no matter how much they tried to rebuild, something had irrevocably broken within them, beyond even Miss Marple's keen eye to mend. The damage, like the truth, would remain, unrelenting, undeniable, and all-consuming. Lavinia stood at the altar, her outward composure a facade that barely concealed the tumultuous thoughts swirling within her. She was a woman irrevocably changed, marked not just by the events that had unfolded around her, but by a brutal past that had caught up with her in ways she couldn't have foreseen. The truth was no longer a distant thing. It had become her reality, undeniable and unyielding. As the vows were exchanged, She felt the weight of her past pushing down on her shoulders, a reminder of the life she'd almost lost, and the secrets that had almost destroyed everything she held dear. The ceremony should have been a moment of new beginnings, but instead it felt like the closing of a chapter she had never truly wanted to write, and yet had no choice but to endure. Miss Marple, seated discreetly at the back of the church, observed with a sharp, unyielding gaze. Her eyes flickered briefly over the couple, but there was no triumph in her look, no satisfaction in seeing the truth unveiled. She had seen this play before, families torn apart by their own lies, the skeletons dragged from the closet, and the slow, inevitable unraveling of lives carefully constructed on the foundation of deceit. Justice had been served. She knew that. The family's darkest secrets had been exposed. Yet, even as the final vows were exchanged, there was no sense of relief or victory in Miss Marple's demeanor. Instead, she felt a quiet sorrow. A sorrow for the family that would never be the same. A sorrow for the broken lives left in the wake of their lies. The wedding bells rang, and the small group of guests filed out of the church, their faces solemn, their steps heavy with the realization of what had transpired. The atmosphere that had once been filled with anticipation and excitement was now thick with the weight of the past, of all the secrets that had been buried, and finally brought to the surface. Yet, as the last of the guests began to filter out, Miss Marple's eyes were drawn to a figure standing just outside the hedge of the churchyard. It was the groom's aunt, the same woman who had hovered in the background of so many of the quiet, tense moments during the investigation. She was standing alone, her figure isolated, as though she had been left behind by the tide of history itself. Clutched tightly in her hands was something that caught Miss Marple's sharp eye, a yellowed love letter, its edges curling with age, the ink faint, as though it had been read over and over again, each reading a silent reminder of a past long buried. The aunt's face, once so composed and controlled, was now marked by something else entirely, regret perhaps, or a deep hidden sorrow. There was a vulnerability in her gaze that Miss Marple had not seen before. She had once been a woman of strength, of self-assurance, but now in this quiet moment, her eyes betrayed a history she had never spoken of. Miss Marple did not approach her. She remained at a distance, watching the aunt as she stood, motionless, gazing down at the love letter. There was a certain stillness to the moment, a tension that seemed to stretch for eternity, as though time itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple understood. Some secrets, she knew, were not meant to be uncovered, not by prying eyes or curious minds. Some things were too painful to confront, too complex to be resolved. Perhaps this was the aunt's moment to reconcile with her past, to confront the choices she had made long ago, choices that had led to the family's tragic unraveling. It was a moment for her to come to terms with what she had hidden for so long, a moment that Miss Marple recognized as one of quiet, painful reflection. The truth, as Miss Marple had come to realize, was never simple. It could clear suspicion, restore honor, even offer redemption, but it could never erase the wounds that had been inflicted along the way. It could not bring back the dead, nor could it undo the damage caused by the secrets that had festered for too long. The imposter bride, Marianne, was gone, her life snuffed out in the pursuit of a family's desperate need to preserve their reputation. Lavinia had been forced to flee, to live a life in hiding, a life of uncertainty, when all she had ever wanted was the simple freedom to live on her own terms. And the Kingsley family, though freed from their lies, had lost far more than they would ever admit. They had lost their innocence, their moral compass, and perhaps their humanity in the process. As Miss Marple sat in quiet contemplation, watching the aunt clutch the letter to her chest, she understood something deeper than the cold logic of the case. Some wounds never healed. Some scars were too deep to fade with time. The wedding, while it had symbolized the culmination of years of deception, was also a reminder of everything that had been lost in the process. There would be no sweeping away of the past, no simple redemption, just the painful truth, the heavy toll of secrets, and the lives that would forever bear the mark of their hidden sins. And so Miss Marple watched in silence, knowing that sometimes, the most profound truths are those we are never meant to uncover, those moments that shape the course of a life but are never shared, never spoken aloud. As the aunt turned slowly and walked away, her footsteps fading into the distance. Miss Marple's mind remained sharp, her thoughts as clear as ever. The case had been solved, but the real story, like so many others, was far more complicated than anyone could have imagined. As Miss Marple walked away from the church, the evening air cooling her face, and the quiet hum of the village settling in around her, she allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. The case was over, the tangled web of lies and deceit unraveled, and Lavinia, after all the years of uncertainty and fear, could finally take a step into a future that was hers to shape. The truth had emerged from the darkness, as it always did, casting a harsh light on the events that had transpired. Yet, even in this moment of resolution, Miss Marple knew better than most, that in every village, behind every door and under every floorboard, there were secrets that never truly vanished. They might be buried, hidden beneath layers of time and silence, but they always lingered, like a shadow that never quite left. The past, with all its grief and guilt, was an unshakable presence that refused to be ignored. She glanced back at the church, now silent, its once vibrant air of anticipation replaced by an uneasy stillness. The groom's aunt, whom she had noticed earlier standing by the hedge, still held the yellowed love letter tightly in her hands. The letter, worn by time and countless readings, was a reminder of a past so carefully concealed that its very existence threatened to unravel the present. Miss Marple did not approach the aunt. Some moments were too private, too personal, to disturb. She knew that some secrets, as painful as they might be, were never meant to be shared, not because they were too dangerous, but because they were too raw, too fraught with sorrow. The aunt, perhaps, needed this moment alone to grapple with a history that had defined her in ways she was never ready to confront. As Miss Marple continued her walk down the quiet village road, she felt a quiet satisfaction settle within her. Justice had been served in its own way, but the road to healing, she knew, was never straightforward. The truth, no matter how difficult to bear, had been exposed, but it would never erase the years of suffering, the hidden scars left behind. The past, with all its secrets, had a way of shaping the present in ways no one could predict. Even as Lavinia stepped into a new chapter, she would always carry the weight of her family's dark legacy with her. Miss Marple understood this better than anyone. The world was full of unspoken stories, tales of betrayal, regret, and love that had been lost to time. In every corner of every village, there were secrets too painful to bring to light, stories that shaped lives, but were never meant to be told. As she turned the corner and disappeared from view, Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet, almost imperceptible smile. In her heart, she knew that while truth had paved the way for Lavinia's freedom, it was not the end of the journey. The shadows of the past, though momentarily cleared, would always have a presence. The truth was the first step toward healing, but healing itself was a slow, painful process, one that required more than just the unveiling of facts. It required time, acceptance, and the courage to move forward in the face of deep emotional wounds. The final, lingering thought that Miss Marple carried with her was simple. No matter how deeply secrets were buried, no matter how hard people tried to erase them, they always found a way to resurface. In the quiet aftermath of justice, as the village settled back into its rhythm, the truth had done its work, but the past, Miss Marple knew, would always remain just out of reach, like the faintest scent on the wind. And for some, it would never truly fade away. As the story of Lavinia's return to confront her family's buried secrets reaches its conclusion, it leaves a lingering question in the air. What happens when the truth sets us free, but the cost is far greater than we ever imagined? Lavinia, standing at the precipice of her past, made the courageous decision to face the very darkness that had haunted her for so long. But what if she had never come back? Could she have lived her life in peace, untouched by the suffocating weight of the lies that held her family in their grasp? Could the truth have remained buried, allowing her to escape the looming shadows of her past? Or was there no true escape, no possibility of peace, without confronting the skeletons that lingered, quietly festering, in the corners of her life? The very essence of freedom, in this case, seem to hinge on the bitter reality that in order to be truly free, one must first face the most painful truths, and sometimes, that truth is more than just a revelation, it's a turning point that forces us to confront not only the lies we've told others, but the lies we've told ourselves. Lavinia's journey, fraught with fear and loss, is a testament to the power of truth, but also to its cost. It raises the question, in seeking freedom from the past, do we ultimately open ourselves to even greater pain? What if the price of uncovering the truth is not just personal sacrifice, but the destruction of everything we thought we understood about ourselves and those around us? Imagine, then, the weight of that choice. Would you have had the courage to return, knowing that doing so might tear apart the fragile life you had managed to build away from the chaos? Could you have lived with the uncertainty, or would the call of truth have been too strong to resist? In her place, would you have chosen to confront your darkest fears, or would you have walked away, content to leave the past behind? What path could have led to the kind of peace that Lavinia sought, and is it even possible to truly be free once the truth has been revealed? These questions linger in the air, unanswered, as the mystery of Lavinia's family unfolds, and the deeper, more personal struggle of confronting one's own past continues to resonate long after the story has concluded. This mystery, at its heart, is about more than just secrets. It's about the complexities of human nature, the choices we make, and the consequences of uncovering truths that once revealed can never be forgotten. As the story concludes, Miss Marple's final observations echo through the room. In every mystery, there's always more than meets the eye. What we think we understand may be only a fraction of the truth, and the secrets we so desperately try to keep hidden are often the ones that shape our fates. The case is closed, the past has been confronted, but the real question remains: how does one move forward when the weight of the truth is too heavy to bear? As the final bell tolls, so does the realization that even the greatest mysteries of life may never be fully understood. There's always more beneath the surface, waiting to be discovered.